So I think with Baldwin, I mentioned the pillars of white supremacy, but if we talk about Malcolm X, I would say the pillars would be truth and then transformation, right? Because if you know his story, he goes from Detroit Red, an individual who was what we would call a hustler, right? So sell reefer, sell weed, he pimped women, right? He robbed houses, he did all these things. Served some time in prison for those activities, right? And then he comes out to become what we know as Malcolm X, right? Even under his time during the Nation of Islam, he would always articulate the words of Elijah Muhammad. And as you get to the later in his life, you know, you see him transform and begin to use his own words because truth guided him away from the Nation of Islam. He found that some of the things that Elijah Muhammad said he was about, he did not actually be about. So he had to reconcile that. Malcolm himself had to reconcile that contradiction, which caused him to split from the Nation of Islam. When we pick up Malcolm in '64, he had split from the Nation of Islam. I want to say he's either on his way to travel abroad in Africa, or he just came back from his Hajj or his pilgrimage back to the Holy Land of Mecca. So again, one of my favorite people of all time. I try to read his autobiography as much as possible. It's not only a great political tool, right, just to understand politics and understand how power is manipulated. It's a great read on how people change, right? It's a great read on just the importance of intellectual curiosity and intelligence. And I think that's another thing that you see throughout Malcolm's life, if you study him closely, just his supreme intellect. So let's get into some things that I found with the Ballad of the Bullet. So one, you have the intersection of religion and politics, right? So he has, as he mentioned, I'm a Muslim. He starts off the article with the speech with, I'm a Muslim, but I also understand that there's political needs that must be met within the Black community, right? So he's going to intersect those two realities. Another element that you find in this speech is a component of the Black radical tradition. It's a component of this notion of what's called Pan-Africanism. We're in the Pan-African Studies department, right? It's the focusing on the similarities of a people juxtaposed to the differences, right? So he's talking about how people in Asia, people in Africa are going to are overthrowing their colonial empires, right? I'm not focusing on how they're different, but I'm focusing on how they're all similarly obtaining their freedom, right? So these are concepts of the Black radical tradition and concepts of Pan-Africanism. He talks about this idea of Black nationalism, right? So this is something that you hear continuously throughout the speech. So you must familiarize yourself with Black nationalism. And he lays out kind of what that platform for Black nationalism will look like. He talks about the lack of ownership and the lack of the dollar being circulated within the Black community, right? He says, you know, if we get some money, we go spend it outside of our neighborhood. Now, one thing that's important when you think about that, so prior to this, him giving the speech, he worked within the Nation of Islam, right? The Nation of Islam in Chicago was like their home base. In the South Side Chicago, in the Black areas of Chicago's, majority of the, just say for example, cleaners were Nation of Islam cleaners. Majority of the businesses were ran, in fact, by the Nation of Islam. So when Malcolm is talking about how the Black dollar can be circulated, he knows this from empirical evidence, right? Like he's seen it work. He's seen the Nation of Islam actuate these ideas. So he's not just speaking theory. This is from a real lived experience, right? I also think one thing that you pick up when you listen to it, just opposed to reading it, is the language and the terminology and the diction of Malcolm. Keep in mind where he's located, right? He's coming up in Harlem. So this is not the Southern church-going folks. This is not, you know, is a vastly different audience from who Martin Luther King is speaking to, right? So Malcolm in kind speaks in a totally different type of dialect, right? He speaks the street language of those who are in New York, right? A lot of the rhyming patterns that you hear Malcolm speaking, he's speaking the language of the streets, if you want to call it that, right? He's very much about a self-sufficiency or a self-help agenda, right? It's not about asking for the Democratic Party, asking for the Republican Party, asking for the Dixiecrats to assist us with our situation. It's more about the Black community taking the situation into our own hands and using what you call agency, right? Using your wills and your talents and your abilities to advance your situation. He's very attentive to the global liberation movements in Africa. Again, he's either coming back from visiting these countries or he's on his way to visiting countries. I don't remember. I know it was in '64. I'm not sure what month in '64 that he made that trip. But he's aware of what's going on, right? He knows that Ghana has received its liberation. He knows that Senegal is in the process of receiving its liberation, right? He knows what's happening in Kenya. So he's attentive to what's going on in the world. And his attentiveness to how colonialism is beginning to fall allows him to position America and the Black American situation as a colonial situation as well. He says, second-class citizenship is equal to colonialism, right? He's placing us in the colonial situation. So for us in this class, we read a lot of anti-colonial work, right? And all the anti-colonial readings that we've done, think about Ngugi, think about Glissant, think about Somé, right? Those are all anti-colonial thinkers. They're all from outside of the United States, right? The United States doesn't think of itself as a colonial institution, right? But think about the history of the United States. It started off with what? The 13 colonies, right? So the United States operates very much in a settler colonial type of fashion. So when Malcolm is relating the global struggle of African people abroad in an anti-colonial situation, he also sees the Black struggle as an anti-colonial struggle as well. He's also very, very attentive to the youth, right? He says, it's going to be a long, hot summer of '64, right? And the youth aren't so willing to be on this kumbaya marching in the street. They're impatient, right? And if they don't reconcile this race issue, the youth are going to tear the city up, right? This is what Malcolm is prophesying. Think about 1964 as the speech is given, 1968 is the birth of the Black Panther, right? So think about the foresight that Malcolm has in his analysis of the American race situation. So this youth culture that he's prophesying and he's foreseeing, it comes in the fruition of the manifestation of the Black beret, the Black leather jacket, and the shotguns patrolling Oakland Police Department. He talks about how the political machine uses these celebrities, right, to help bring in the Black vote, right? He talks about how the Black vote has been what you call the swing vote, so that the white vote is so evenly divided, right? Wherever the Black vote classes its vote as a block is the determining factor to who gets placed in office. This is what he says, right? So he says what they do is they use these Black celebrities to garner the support of the Black community, right? I just seen at the rallies, they had 2 Chainz, right, for Biden, right? Little Pimp for the Trump campaign, or Little Pump, we mistakenly called him, right? So again, this is '64 that Malcolm is talking about this. It has not changed in 2020, right? And then, so when I was young, right, and I first heard this, I always read this or understood this as a juxtaposition, because even the title, right, it's the ballot or the bullet, right? So I took a position, and I was young, I don't know, maybe like freshman year of high school or some shit. I took a position that he was anti-voting, and this is what he's saying, is the anti-voting speech, right? But with a more attentive read, that's really not what Malcolm's up to. What he's saying is being conscious of our vote, right? Being conscious of the return of our vote, right? Keep this in mind. Historically, one of the most celebrated presidents prior to Obama, prior to Bill Clinton, within the Black community was Kennedy, right? John F. Kennedy was one of the widely most recognized and celebrated president within the Black community. This speech that Malcolm is giving is post the Kennedy assassination, right? So this lets you know that even Kennedy did very little to advance the situation of Black people's daily lives and daily situations, right? It didn't change much. So he's making this critique of the failures of politics as it pertains to addressing Black needs, right? So he's saying, one, understand your vote when you vote as a block. Does everybody understand when he says a voting block? Does that make sense when he uses that terminology? Yes, no, kind of.
Does it comply with like they could vote, but they were like 1/3 of a person, so they like
Not necessarily. You're talking about the representation of voting. But when he's
yeah.
saying voting as a block, it's saying we all vote together, right? So no matter, it's not about I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican. Nah, we're voting as Black people. Our interest is for the understanding of the advancement of Black people. So that's what he means when he says we're voting as a block, right? So when we understand our power when voting as a block, that's when voting becomes powerful. That's when voting becomes meaningful. That's when voting can do something for you, right? But what we have been trapped in the habit of doing is supporting these candidates, these parties blindly without receiving the benefits or the promises that they're going to give us, right? So right now in our current time, we have the platinum plan that Trump has on the table for Black folks, right? And we have the unknown plan from the Democratic Party, right? And correct me if I'm wrong. Has a Biden or Chuck Taylor wearing or Timberlake wearing Kamala Harris, has she provided any type of platform for the Black community? I haven't heard it. Okay. So we know there's this mysterious platinum plan. Okay. So what Malcolm is saying is don't vote for either of them until you can ensure that he's going to be able to cash in on his platinum plan, or one, the Democratic Party has a plan in action that they can cash in on, right? So until we can ensure that, there's no point of us voting or supporting these candidates, right? So it's not voting for the sake of voting, it's voting for the sake of power, right? This is what Malcolm is trying to get us to be attentive to. Then he goes into this idea of, did everybody understand the Democrats and the Dixiecrats? Did he understand that juxtaposition, how he tried to lay out that argument? Does anyone have questions around what a Dixiecrat is? What is the difference he was trying to articulate? Everybody understood it?
Explain a little more on the difference.
So where we see the Dixiecrats come into play, he's challenging the idea of racism being a Southern problem, right? He says, anytime that you're south of the Canadian border, you're south, right? So it's not about Northern people being not racist. So he's talking about the Democratic Party because historically we, as Black folks, vote for the Democratic Party. But he's saying these Dixiecrats, these Southern Democrats, right? So think about, again, we're back in '64 where they're trying to organize around the civil rights in the South and segregated lunch counters and things of that nature, right? So he's saying that the Dixiecrats, these Southern Democrats, are no different from the Northern Democrats, right? They're the two sides of the same coin, right? So how could you assume that as racist as the South is, but they're still Democratic, that the Northern Democrats don't carry the same type of racism, right? He says, in fact, when Kennedy died, I believe it was Johnson who took his place, right? Who he brought in office was a Southern Democratic person to be the vice president. And he was the Democratic governor of Georgia or something like that, which was heavily segregationist, right? Which were a lot of the civil rights activities were happening right in his backyard, and he was stamping a lot of those activities out, right? So here we have a Northern Democrat takes the place in office, and he brings this Southern politician with him. But the South is supposed to be only the racist one and not the North, right? So Michael was saying, like, let's not get fooled by this notion of Southern Dixiecrats and Northern Democrats. They're both racist. They're both part of a racist institution, right? What else we got? Also, what becomes present, right, is a collective notion of freedom. Malcolm is not talking about just him becoming free. He talks about it for all of African people, right? For all of Black people within the confines of America. So it's a collective notion of freedom and liberation, not a single or individual notion of freedom and liberation. There's an apocalyptic prophecy to his speech. What does that mean, an apocalyptic prophecy? What does that invoke when I use that terminology? An apocalyptic prophecy. So what is the apocalypse? Right.
The apocalypse, in like, I guess his sense would be the destruction of Black, well, what was the term he used? Black, I can't remember the term he used, but like the society of Black people. So, and he would be like predicting it,
right?
Sort of.
So what he's prophesying, and where the apocalypse comes in, right, is going to be the destruction of the society as we know it if the circumstances that plague the Black community aren't addressed, right? So if we don't fix poverty, if we don't fix unemployment, right, these things that are placed intentionally in the Black community, right, the apocalypse will bring forth. And that apocalypse is the youth culture that he's talking about that will be rioting and burning these streets down, right? We talk about he starts off with the thing of, so he starts off his speech mentioning his new mosque, Muslim Mosque Incorporated, that's coming out of the split that he has with the Nation of Islam. He also will go on to found the Organization of Afro-American Unity. So that would become the political organization that he would use to address the human rights issues of Black folks. Whereas Muslim Mosque Incorporated would be the Orthodox Islamic institution that he would institute in New York. But this idea, though, of shifting to a human rights struggle opposed to a civil rights struggle becomes very important for Malcolm. And it becomes his project towards the later years of his life, right? You also see a shift in the way he views his contemporaries, right? So in the past, he was very critical of those who would seek to integrate, right? He's very critical of Martin Luther King and his integrationist nonviolent strategies. But now in the Malcolm that we read, he's open to working with these individuals, right? He even mentions that integration is one tactic to the same objective, which is freedom, right? So he says Martin Luther King's tactic is integration. Mine is separation, but our objectives are the same, right? So you see the shift in the way that he looks at even his contemporaries. But this human rights issue becomes important. And if we are to take this conversation into our now, this is where I really see some of the profundity of Malcolm's thinking. And we may have talked about this before, but what does Black Lives Matter mean in the statement, right? What does that mean in its implicit? What are you trying to advocate for when you say Black Lives Matter?
I may not be like correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about advocating for the lives lost to the system, and how that their lives aren't being prioritized as any other lives. So that's why when people say like all lives matter, like, okay, but you know, my leg broke, your leg is fine.
Right,
you know?
Right, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Does anybody want to add on to that?
I feel it's just like against like the systemic racism. Like racism is so deeply rooted in our society and in the justice system that like police are able to get away with murdering Black African Americans with no, like they literally do it on camera with no fear of consequences. Like that's ridiculous. Why would you, like, they literally can murder people on camera. And so I think that it's like the movement is like protesting the racism deeply rooted in the system, and it's advocating for all Black people, but it's just like the people that are the face of it are the lives that have been lost to the system.
Perfect. You guys, so I'm gonna thread together your two responses, right? Because those are perfectly stated. So to summarize what Cecilia says, it's a question of value, right? Black lives don't have the same value as other lives. That's why someone could come up with the idea or allow come out of their mouth that all lives matter, right? It's a question of value. What Alyssa is saying is there's a systemic issue that allows some group of people to disproportionately be murdered at a higher rate with no type of repercussions for that, right? So what we're dealing with is a question of a people, a particular people's humanity, right? And that's why this whole notion of Black Lives Matter is a term to affirm the humanity of Black people, right? So now, if in fact, this is what we're dealing with, and this is what the organization of our time, right, is the Black Lives Matter movement, right? What we have at hand is the question of Black humanity, right? So what sense does it make to fight an issue of humanity at a civil level? Do you guys see the difference between a civil issue and a human issue, right? Civil issue is I can't go to school where I would like to, or our schools are inadequate, right? I don't have proper access to food. Actually, that's a human rights issue. Let me not get the two confused. So things that make up your civil life and your civil society, right? My ability to practice religion is being infringed upon, right? That's a civil issue, right? But when you're dealing with things of survival, food, right? The ability just to walk from one place to another without being murdered, right? These are human issues. What Malcolm is also saying is it makes no sense to take the crime before the criminal and expect justice. So the same people who are committing these murders that Alyssa is talking about, right? When we expect for them to get punished or reprimanded or to be held to justice, they're going before their bosses. They work with these people, right? The judge, the police, they all work together, right? That's like my son punching you in the face and you coming to tell my son to me like, yo, your son punched me. I'm gonna ride with my son, right? So this is what we're dealing with. So what Malcolm is saying, who do we take a human rights issue to court with? What's that court, right? You look at the issue in Palestine, that's a human rights issue, right? You look at the Jewish Nazi conflict, that was a human rights issue, right? The whole world got involved to stop that conflict, right? There was a world war that conflict ensued because there were human rights violations, right? How is this different than what's going on to Black people since Black people got here? But we are trying to fight this issue at a civil level. Malcolm's saying, nah, it's a human rights issue. So his job was to take this conversation before the UN and have a human rights conversation. And that's what he was doing before he got snatched from this earth, right? So those are my thoughts about the reading. I want to get into your guys' thoughts. I read off the list of who has fishbowled already this semester. If you have not fishbowled, you might want to volunteer or make it known that you want to fishbowl so you get those points. Again, we could talk about some things that I mentioned in my little lecture about the readings, or you could just talk about whatever you find of interest. I know a lot of you guys have fishbowled already, but Christopher, are you prepared to fishbowl or have you fishbowled already?
I actually don't know if I have or not. I'm not sure.
So I would say no if you ain't sure. Are you prepared to fishbowl?
But no, unfortunately, I'm not prepared today.
For sure. So remember, you have one time to pass without losing any points.
Yeah.
I think I want to say everybody else is fishbowl though. Andrea, have you fishbowl?
I have already.
I thought so. Esperanza, have you fishbowl?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, I think for the most part, this group is good. But again, if you have not, your name was not called off, You know, you make sure that you want to make sure you get those points. So we'll do this. We'll open it. We could do one of two things. We could do breakout groups for the last half hour, or we could just open up the conversation. You could also infuse what was talked about, what Malcolm talked about, excuse me, to what's going on with our now, right? Like the two fit. So it would be wise scholarship to bring in what we read to what's going on in our now. So would you prefer to do breakout groups or just conversate?
Can we just conversate? I feel like that would be beneficial, like just get all voices in at once.
I agree. All right, so conversate. Shit, right.
One thing, when I was listening to it, I kind of knew that was going to happen. I heard my dogs fighting. One thing I found interesting in the reading was he was comparing like his views to Martin Luther's compared to the sit-ins. And he was saying how anybody can sit in. I think he said a chump can sit in. And he was saying that we need to stand. We need to like group together for, and then he used the term again. I can't remember what it is.
Like nationalism.
Yes, that one exactly. And I just thought that was like very like empowering, just like to just, if the actions you do, like they do have meaning, but he was like, if you do the actions a certain way, they have like a way of standing out more towards your purpose.
Yeah, and I think he does a lot of that play with juxtapositions and words, right? Like, you know, we do enough singing, right? It's time to start swinging. So you see these kind of play with words and kind of like little subtle shots at the civil rights movement, you know. But it's really about this agency. And, you know, one thing about Malcolm to me that I love was he's unafraid. Like, I'm gonna tell you the truth regardless of how you feel about it, right? I'm not going to, and that's what I think what people loved about him, right? You have to understand, like in '64, you don't hear Black folks talking like that, right? You don't hear Black people affirming themselves. Even when you talk about activism of the time, it's almost subservient. And this is what he's saying, like a sit-in, you know, like what is that? He said, your mama can sit down, right? Like that's not really doing nothing. So we're here to disrupt and disturb. And I think also what you hear when you listen is the urgency. He wants this to happen now, right? Who else?
Okay, I don't mind going. But what I was saying is like this is perfect, I guess in some sense, maybe not the time frame, but this is perfect to like what's going on today and how he really wanted everything to happen. Because with the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a lot of protesting, and then like people would see it as like a violent and like destructive and like a negative thing. When I seen it as like an awesome thing, like we've never had this type of, you know, outcome. Like in the protest, like everyone's just been kind of calm with like the civil rights movement and everything. But I like that there's noise. I like that there's like it's not peaceful, because this shouldn't be peaceful, you know. It's like you said, a human rights issue. So you shouldn't be comfortable knowing that there are lives at stake every day because of the way you look. That's just absurd.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Cecilia, and it's really to highlight this idea of comfort, right? Like when you hear about some of the complaints that people make about the protests now, it's making me late to work, right? Like, why are they blocking off the freeway? You know, part of the protest is to disturb the normal behavior, right? It's to make you uncomfortable, to make you slightly understand that it's uncomfort that we have to deal with on a daily basis, right? So you may be uncomfortable for this 15, 20, 30 minutes that you're sitting here in traffic, but I have to deal with this every day, all day, right? So that's a very good point. Who else?
Can I go?
Yeah.
I had liked the point that he said about like until we I wrote it down. He said until we like become politically mature, like people will always be misled and like to vote for someone who isn't like at the heart. And I feel like that kind of like ties to today. Like I feel like there's so much like political tension today. And it's like hard to like even have a conversation with somebody. Like if you have a different view with somebody, like I understand like some points where it's like, okay, like I cannot talk to you if you like go
Right.
for this that's against human rights. But I feel like for some things it's like it doesn't have to do with a human right issue. Excuse me. Then it's like I want to understand why you're voting for that. And it's like some people they just clash and it's like no one can come to an understanding or even be open-minded for some like normal political things.
You know, this is a really, really good point. And there's three things that I'm hearing in your conversation. One, the political maturity, and that's something that also jumped out at me right now. And it made me really question, especially for the Black community, it made me question the political maturity even today. Is it there? Because I see, as I mentioned earlier, right, they're doing the same tricks in 64 that they're doing today, right? And we're falling for the same shit. So I'm like, how political mature are we as a community? Also, what I hear in your conversation is this idea of discourse, right? It's okay to have opposite opinions, but to your point, right, not when it comes to things as it pertains to my human rights. Now, I'm not about to go back and forth with you on that, but I'm okay with you having a different political view, right? So for example, I don't consider myself a capitalist, right? We exist in a capitalist society, but I am a socialist, right? I abide by socialist principles. I believe that the wealth of the country, I believe the wealth of production should go to the masses of the people, not just a small percentage of the people, right? But because I'm a socialist does not mean that I shouldn't be able to conversate or get ideas from people who operate from a capitalist framework, right? You're all scholars. There are going to be people who have opposing ideas, opposing theories that you're going to come across in your seminars, in your courses, right? That shouldn't allow you not to engage in intellectual activity, right? Really, some of the best scholarship or intellectual work is taking two seemingly opposing ideas and being able to bring them together, right? So a fascinating thing would be, you hear a lot of people write about the beef between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. There's a lot of literature and there's a lot of scholarship about that. But what would be fascinating is for somebody to write a scholarship or a book on how they were similar or how their movements helped advance Black struggle, right? One example of that, if you think about how they were positioned, right? Malcolm X was positioned as a radical. He was positioned as violent, right? Martin Luther King was positioned as nonviolent. He was not radical. He was the go-to Black man, right? Everyone was comfortable with him, right? But because of it being a Malcolm X, that made Martin Luther King a lot more likable, right? Their thinking is, I would rather listen to Martin Luther King than have to deal with this Malcolm X shit, right? So really, they worked hand in hand to advance the struggle for Black people, right? I would guarantee you, if there was no Malcolm X, there would be no civil rights bill, right? Because the fear of what he was prophesying moved the state a lot more than what Martin Luther King was doing, right? I'm okay with you marching to Washington the way that I say for you to march to Washington, right? Because you're playing by my rules. What he's talking about, he ain't talking about no rules. I'll take that one, right? So if you think about the ways that they work together, you could see how this could really be an interesting, research or interesting intellectual theory. So another thing that Eileen is talking about is not being so emotional in your intellectual processes, your ability to analyze things. That's a very good point. Who else?
Oh, you can go, listen.
Oh, okay. I wanted to say I thought it was interesting. I didn't watch like his whole speech. I was only able to watch like the first 30 minutes, but I found it interesting that he was talking about how he wanted to separate politics from like human rights issues. I mean religion from politics, which a lot of people like nowadays they use like religion as a clutch for like their racist views in politics and like their homophobic views and stuff. And so like I don't know, I like admire that because he's right, like you should. It's not God's fault that you don't like gay people, like, you know? So
Yeah.
I found it interesting that he like thought to separate the two because that's right, that's what should be done. But
Yeah, just because he didn't want it to distract from the agenda, right? Like I should be able to, because I'm a Muslim, I should be able to organize with somebody who's a Christian for the betterment of Black people. It's a very good point. Cassandra?
I was gonna say something similar to what she said. I liked how he was like, okay, yeah, I know I'm a Muslim, but right now I'm not gonna try to convert you. I'm not gonna try to say what is right and what is wrong. Like we need to put that aside because what he says is we're all on the same boat and we're all going to catch the hell from the same man, right? Because like at the end of the day, we're all going to the same place at the end, right? And so what Alyssa was saying, I also found very interesting that when you talk to someone about their political views, a lot of the arguments are, well, it's because I'm Catholic, Christian, or I'm religious, period. And in the Bible it says that you shouldn't love gay people, etc. But if you really think about it, be religious or not, what God is about is to love other people, love your community, and love others. Because that's like part of humanity.
Yeah.
So what I never understood is why people do use religion in that negative aspect when they're racist. Because it doesn't really follow what God's word is, if that makes sense.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm trying not to get too deep on like PhD level with y'all, but because really what you're raising are some really deep questions. So what you're critiquing is modernity, right? Because if you think about how religion and power get introduced in this modernity, think about slavery, right? Religion was fundamental in the actuation of slavery, right? This is a Christian nation. The United States is a Christian nation, right? So a lot, and then you guys don't have to think hard about what went into the creation of this nation, right? So what you guys are talking about are the principles that guide these religions. But what happens is people don't use the principles, right? They use religion as a tool for power. And oftentimes that's why you have this manipulation of religious practices and principles, it was like you had the Berlin Conference, and then you had, which decided who was going to take what part of Africa. And then you also had the Papal Bull, which was the Catholic Church saying, let's go out and grab African people because they're heathens and we could place them into slavery, right? So that was the church and power that came into play. Go ahead, Eileen, what were you going to say?
Oh, like back to like the religion thing. I feel like some people like they'll only use it when it's at convenience for them, instead of like regularly, like just to like. I guess they use it as an excuse for their beliefs. Like, oh, the Bible says this, so no.
Yeah. So I'm reading this cat. His name is Frantz Fanon, and he says that in a colonial context, religion is used because it absolves men of their responsibility, right? So I did this because the devil made me do it, right? Or I'm going to do these things because it's the godlike thing to do, right? So what it does is it doesn't allow you to be responsible for my actions, right? Now, I just did that shit because I was fucked up. Like the devil made me do it, right? So you're right. You could use these things when it's convenient. You could use these things to maintain your innocence, right? You could use these things to justify inhumane acts. But to your guys' point, all those things deviate from what the core of these religious practices are, right? Because at the end of it, it's about loving your fellow human being, right? The golden rule is in all religions. Like that's one thing that's universal, right? Like they all talk about that. Very good point. Who else?
I don't know. I just want to add something that um the like I had wrote in my paper about how like white people control like the pen and what we learn in school and stuff. So I know growing up like in a public school, um you would see civil rights movement pictures as in black and white to perceive that it happened so long ago that you wouldn't be like, oh, it's okay, it happened a long ass time ago. Like, no, it didn't. Like, it literally just happened, and it's crazy how we're 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 taught that. Like, we perceive it, and then we see it like, oh, it's in black and white. That means it happened a long time ago. So you're like automatically like, it's like we're it's still there. It's the systematic racism is still there no matter what, even in our education system. And it's crazy because you would never because I would really like history, like that was my subject. So, and I told my teacher, I was like, why is it that we only read about like black authors during you know, the um Black History Month? Why is it that we can't always read about them like in regular teaching, like Manifest Destiny and stuff like that, like their point of view? And then she was like, well, it's because white people control the pen, you know, it's education. And I find that crazy how we're still fighting for it, and it's still like an issue.
Yeah. And because of them still controlling the pen is why we're still dealing with the same issue. You know what I mean? If what we learned hasn't changed, how do you expect to change how we behave, right? It's all directly related. Jamina, what's your thoughts about the reading?
Okay, so my point of view toward so there was this part that I underlined and said, and I see America through the eyes of the victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare. And honestly, if we think about it, that's like what's going on today. It's crazy how like time has passed and we're still fighting for like basic human rights, you know, how women are you know, I know we're talking about like African American human rights, but you know, women are are losing their rights, you know, just their right to like have a choice towards their body. And also like, you know, with people of like gay marriage, you know, like it's crazy how, you know, you can't have a choice for yourself. People are making choices for you. And I don't know, it's just crazy that we are living in a world that like we can't have our own choice towards like each other. People who are in power are making the choices for us, which, you know, shouldn't be like that.
You're absolutely right. I do want to kind of shift your thinking a little bit though, Jamina. So keep in mind there's black women, right? There's black gay folks, right? So although this conversation, yes, is dealing with the black community, all those intersections fit within the black community, right? So you really don't even have to compartmentalize that conversation, you know? It's the same conversation. So you could think about it in a broader context, because I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but the way you said it is as if the black situation is only embodied in a black man. Does that, you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, you're totally right. Like my mistake, you know, I'm sorry the way I interpreted it.
No, and
but
I'm not. I just trying to kind of get you to think about it in other ways.
yeah. You know, yeah, totally. You have a great point in pointing that out.
Yeah. So one thing I was curious, because nationalism is it's like a dog whistle word now, right? Like it has so much meaning behind it. And then we read something where someone's advocating for this idea of black nationalism. So kind of two conversations that we could have here. One, how do you guys interpret or understand nationalism as it pertains in our context in our world today? And then the other conversation we could have is like, how did it make you feel when you heard Malcolm talk about Black nationalism? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. So one, how do you guys understand this term of nationalism as it works today? They would call the Proud Boys a white nationalist group, right? The Boogaloo Boys would be called a white nationalist group, right? Oftentimes when you see American nationalists, they look like the alt-right.
Isn't the nationalism just like the ideology that you would like, they accept their country, or like they would do anything for their country, I guess,
Yes. Yep, absolutely, Alyssa. So your allegiance is to your country regardless, right? And so what you have is a lot of these groups that are nationalists are also anti-government, right? I want to say last week, one of the Proud Boys got arrested for shooting at the police, right? These are white folks doing this shit, right? In the name of America, right? In the name of patriotism, right? So this is how nationalism is appearing on the scene in our now. But we're reading in 1964, and now Malcolm is talking about a Black nationalism. So what did you guys interpret or what was your understanding of what Malcolm was talking about when he was saying a Black nationalism?
I interpreted Black nationalism as like all Black people have to stand together in order to fight for their voice in the country, and that's how they made their place in it.
Absolutely. Anybody else had any similar interpretations or different interpretations or questions around this idea of Black nationalism?
I agree with Ariane that like Black people just had to like defend themselves and start standing up for their own rights, and so like their allegiance was towards the Blackness, their Blackness. That's what like I took it like Black nationalism as.
That's it. That's it. Your Blackness comes first, right? So before I'm a man, I'm a Black man, right? Before whatever religious practice it is, I'm Black first, right? Before my orientation, I'm Black first. This is this idea of Black nationalism, right? And it's not to say that those other intersections don't matter, but for my political purpose and for my advancement in this society, I have to prioritize my Blackness, right? And it doesn't take away from anyone else's situation, but I'm going to move in a fashion that authenticates and prioritizes me as a Black individual. So no, that's really dope, because a lot of people they misread that and they get thrown off by just that phrasing. So I'm really glad that you guys picked up on that the way that you should. Okay, so we'll call it a day there. Next reading is going to be Martin Luther King. I think it's I've Been to the Mountaintop, but it's up on your Google Classroom. We'll do a little bit of a juxtaposition between Malcolm and Martin. And again, we're getting into the oral, right? We're getting into start hearing speeches. So we're gonna talk a lot about style next week, because now you have two styles to compare. You can listen to Malcolm and you'll hear Martin. You can have a conversation around style. Everyone should have received their midterms and the grades for their journals. If you didn't, shoot me an email. But overall, everybody did very well. I was really pleased. I really enjoyed reading your responses and kind of seeing your guys' thoughts, and seeing you guys engage and struggle with the material was really dope. So if there's any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Do meet with your groups. Actually, give me 1 second before I let you guys out, because Chelsea, you want Chelsea Alvarez. You have in your group Diana, Cecilia, and Ingrid. I'm going to kind of set up, I will email you, Chelsea, the other three people's email, so that way you could kind of meet and discuss your project. But other than that, meet, start talking about your projects, start thinking about your projects, because we'll be there before you know it, okay? Other than that, you guys be safe. Again, go get your supplies, you know what I'm saying? Hunker it down. If you can, be in the house, you know what I'm saying? If you got to be out, keep your head on the swivel. Don't, you know what I mean? Don't be out here playing if you don't have to be, you know what I mean? Because it's serious. Other than that, be safe, be well, y'all. See you next week.